Okay, I think we can start. We were just waiting because apparently there's a huge traffic jam outside, so we were just waiting to make sure everybody could come in, although probably they'll be trickling in the coming minutes. So we're very, on behalf of the Isam Ferris Institute for Public Policy, International Affairs, and the Program in Public Policy and International Affairs in the PSPA department, the Center for Middle East Studies, as well as the Center for American Studies. I mean, there's a bunch of people and institutions at AUB that are very happy to co-sponsor this intriguing talk by Major General Arthur David Gawn of New Zealand. And the title is The Future Nature of Conflict, How War Will Evolve. It's a tantalizing prospect and we all look forward to it. Just I'll very briefly introduce General Gawn from New Zealand. He was announced as the head of, for our purposes, he was the head of the mission and chief of staff of the UN Truce Supervision Organization, or UNTSO, in the summer of 2015. He brings to the position extensive command experience and knowledge of peacekeeping attained through service in both national and international contexts. He's currently the Chief of Army in New Zealand, a position he's held since 2013. He's also had a number of senior positions in the New Zealand Army. He's also been quite heavily involved in various peacekeeping missions, including commanding the Kiwi Company and the United Nations Protection Force in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1994, as well as in the UN Transitional Administration in East Timor in the year 2000. The General holds a master's degree in strategic studies from Deakin University in Melbourne in Australia, and he's also attended the Center for Defense and Strategic Studies in Canberra in Australia. He's the graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas and the School of Advanced Warfighting in Quantico in Virginia. It's his second visit to AUB, at least this is his first public talk, and we're very, very happy to welcome you on behalf of all of AUB. Thank you.
Thank you. I will actually sit down for most of this, but I'll just stand. It is traditional in New Zealand to do it au parapara. Hei tui tui I tātou, tui I roke, tui I raro, tui ki roto, tui ki waho, tui I te whakaro katahi, ti hei Māori ora. At tā parapara, all it says is that we should be bound as a society from above, from below, from within and from without, to become as one people. Behold the breath of life. And that would be a wonderful thing when I look here in the Middle East and what's happening. I will sit down just so that you can hear. Can you hear? Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is great to be back here in Beirut. It is only my third visit here, and I do find it a fascinating city, a great city actually. This talk, came from a conversation that we had with Kareem, and in a moment of weakness, I'm not sure why. I said, look, Kareem, I'll come in and talk on anything you want, and he actually followed through on it, so that was a bit of a surprise for me. In terms of the topic, the nature of future conflict, it's something I've always found fascinating, which is probably appropriate considering of my background and everything else. But as a career professional of some 30-something years in the military, studying the history of war, and then coming to the Middle East, which is as we would call it, a battle laboratory on what future conflict is about, on the character and the nature of warfare. And I do find it fascinating in terms of being able to see it actually evolve here in the Middle East. In the words of the great military prophet Clausewitz, the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that a statesman and a commander has to make is to establish what kind of war, the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its true nature. This is the first of all strategic questions and the most comprehensive. And if you look back in history, and this is a Western approach in terms of what I'm going to talk about tonight, but we in the West fail in this time and time again. And it is in part because we don't really understand what future conflict will be, how it's changing, how rapidly, but more importantly, how to develop our armies, our defence forces to actually to deal with the issues. I want to give just a little bit of context. As Karim said, I come from New Zealand, and that is, or gives me a unique perspective in terms of global politics. It's a maritime nation. It's slightly smaller than Australia, and some of you might be confused about that. It's just that 95% of it is actually underwater. And we have a unique outlook on the world. And if you imagine Wellington as the centre of the globe, but if you imagine it as the centre of the globe, all you can see is the east coast of Australia, and you can see Antarctica, and you can't see much else other than this massive expanse of water. So that's a unique perspective on the world, particularly when you turn that around, and I should have done it on the screen with Google Maps, and put Beirut in the centre of the world and see that it is land, it's a land mass with all the complexities that come with land borders and everything else. We're very fortunate that we don't have any of that to deal with. So it is a unique perspective on the world. We have no physical threats, but our area of responsibility actually extends from Antarctica all the way up to the equator. It is in fact the fourth largest area of responsibility of any nation in the world, in terms of resource protection and in terms of search and rescue. And to manage that, we have a tiny defence force, just 10,000 regular forces, consisting of a small navy, an air force, but no combat air, and an army based on a regular force brigade supported by reservists. Now, why do I say that? It's because of where we are expeditionary in our outlook. And everything that we do in terms of that expeditionary outlook and where we deploy our forces has to be based around considerations of the type of battle, the type of conflict that we're getting into, who the adversary is. So we look at this, as I say, with all the failings of every Western nation in terms of not learning our lessons, but it is fundamental to everything that we do. You'll note that I have quite a cultured accent in comparison to a lot, but it can be nonetheless difficult to understand, and I apologise because New Zealanders or Kiwis generally talk really quickly. So I'll try and slow it down a little bit, but also bear in mind that I get off the track a little bit. I'll dive down into a rabbit hole, and that's why I'm not going to let you do any questions until afterwards, otherwise we won't get through this. I'm not a historian nor an academic. I am a soldier. And for those of us who wear the uniform, it doesn't matter where we are in the world. War, the uniform and war, it is actually a passion. It's almost a calling on life in terms of that regular force element that we have. And in line with that, fighting is also a passion in terms of a lifetime study. So tonight, that's all I want to discuss is war. A fascinating topic. And in particular future war, as opposed to where it's come from. And it is the candy store, and it shows all of the characteristics and the predictions of academia. Writers such as Colin Gray, Mary Calder, Scott Wilson, Rupert Smith, Frank Hoffman, Ralph Peters, Liang and Jiang Su, and so many others. What they have written about is unfolding right here in the Middle East right now. And it has for the last probably 10 to 15 years, if you look back at the 2006 Lebanese war with Hezbollah. So it is often said that the nature of war is enduring. It is and will remain a fundamentally human endeavour that epitomises Clausewitz's holy trinity of passion, politics and probability, a clash of wills. It is also said, however, that its character, what it looks like, what it tastes like and what it smells like to those on the ground at the front, is constantly evolving. When I say that they're at the front line, I don't just mean that kinetic edge, because the front line is constantly moving. And today's front line includes cyberspace, it includes social media, public affairs, and the economic battle lines that are drawn in every country. The speed and diffusion of information, the constant media pressure at the locus of battle, hybrid adversaries employing asymmetric tactics and weapons in ungoverned spaces, and the bewildering pace and cost and accessibility of technological change. It is, to put it simply, complex, dynamic, and uncertain. But what does that actually all mean for armies that are built around capability, organisations and structures that function on hierarchy, discipline and orders, because that's the Western model? Perhaps it actually means a lot less than we think, but it also means everything. And what I mean by that statement is that the Western-style armies are equipped, organised and structured based on lessons that are learned from yesterday's wars and our best guess at the future and the next contingency from where we stand, both geopolitically and in terms of time, from where we stand today. And that's appropriate. Now, we're living in an ever more dynamic, disordered and demanding world in which agility, adaptability and resilience are the essence of our security. We live in an unpredictable era. Now, who would have thought the current situation that's evolving in Syria would have come along the track that it has over the last 6 months, or the Ukraine a year ago, or perhaps even the West Bank today? The challenge is not responding to what we know today, but rather preparing for and adapting to what tomorrow will bring. But the question is, against what? The fight where? Against who? And in today's environment of the United Nations and coalitions, alongside who? And whatever the answer is to those questions, the odds-on favourite is that the soldier won't have everything that he or she needs, let alone wants. In the words of Professor Michael Howard, no matter how clearly one thinks, it is impossible to anticipate precisely the character of future conflict. The key is not to be so far off the mark that it becomes impossible to adjust once that character is revealed. You know, the more that I explore future conflict and the environment of that conflict, the more I'm convinced that there are elements of this wicked problem, in Peter Paret's words, the cognitive challenge of future conflict, that are yet to be culturally internalised in the way that we fight, or more specifically, in how we raise, train and educate our armies in the West. I want to just try and frame that problem quite quickly. There's 3 key environmental influences, and they shape the battlefield. There's 5 sort of determining characteristics that I'll go through briefly that are representative of conflict today and tomorrow. And then some meta-trends that we can draw from that that actually show what the future conflict land battle will actually look like. But all that is the weather report. The environment that we live, work and fight in is something that we can't actually change, let alone influence particularly well. I then want to ask, so what? To explore the implications of these trends to the way that we organise, train and structure armies, identify options that will better prepare us for tomorrow's battles. As I said, it'll be a once-over lightly because I am conscious of the time. But those 3 key influences, population or demographics, and in particular population growth, resource competition and depletion, and climate change. Now, none of those should be new. But these gathering storm clouds are the wicked problem that is unbounded and insoluble, with no clear relationship between cause and effect, and no single institution able to control the outcome. And of those, the biggest single influence to my mind that we have to get our heads around is demographics. A world population that is expected to grow to 9+ billion by 2050, mostly in the economic south. Hosni Mubarak had this to say about that in 2008, and it's quite instructive. And as an example of the region and particularly these issues, Egypt is a study in and of itself. But with respect to this environmental factor, he observed that in 1960, both Egypt and South Korea had a population of about 26 million people. Now South Korea has a population of 48 million, and we have a population of around 80 million people. He went on to say that population increase is increasingly devouring any returns resulting from economic development and growth. And we have to admit that the demographic dilemma is the cornerstone of the gap between our ceiling of our ambition and our limited resources. Egypt, as Goldman and Nafiz Ahmed would say, is in fact on the brink of a protracted state collapse process, driven by intensifying resource scarcity and exacerbated by climate change and uncontrollable population growth. Underlying growing instability is the Egyptian state's increasing inability to contain the devastating social impacts of an interconnected population, energy, water and food crises over the last few decades. They hit oil peak in 1996, and energy consumption now outstrips production, notwithstanding and hopefully the discovery of the new offshore gas fields will resolve some of that. Over the last decade, government debt of 85.5% GDP, an expanding population that's grown exponentially by 21% since 2000. Currently 81 million, and by 2025 the expected population is likely to be 104. By 2050, close to 140 million people, a change of 70%. Youth represent 25% of that, and more than half of them suffer from poverty and unemployment. And 40% of the population live on less than $2 a day, with rates of illiteracy and unemployment hovering around a third of the population. The issue of all of this is quite simply that eventually it translates to political outrage. And we saw that in the Arab Spring. And that political outrage in and of itself transcends to violence. And that is the environment that armies have to move into. When you take that further and you look at food, it imports almost 70%, according to PayPal, of its food today. Just imagine being President Sisi and looking in the mirror and just asking one simple question that he has to ask every day. How do I feed my people today? Not tomorrow, not the next day, but today. The situation of water is equally dire. In fact, it's probably more dire. In the 60s, Egypt had 3,000 cubes per capita, about 95% drawn from the Nile, as it still is. Today it has 660 cubes per capita, and water poverty is measured at 1,000 cubes. The challenge with that is that with local climate change impacts and water mismanagement and regional geopolitics, including the dam that's being built upriver, the possibility is that water could be choked off by 2025, by which time Egypt will require 20% more water than it currently has today. As I said, these issues, they're not unique. The OECD says that almost half the world's population is living in areas of water scarcity. They're not unique. It's just illustrative of a global problem that actually includes areas down in my own backyard in the Southwest Pacific. So as I say, it's illustrative of many regions. We haven't even touched on climate change, but the military challenges arising from this trifecta are pretty scary. And it's unfolding on our doorstep here in the Middle East. Youth bulges. They're mobile, they're generally urban, they're unemployed, they're easily led by the disaffected urban elite. Now they talk about in the West Bank that part of the problem is that there are too many uneducated and too many overeducated people that don't have jobs. And the other thing with the youth today is that they are connected. Displaced diaspora and urban migration, environmental refugees, shifts in disease vectors, and more natural disasters. In short, it's likely to increase the scale and frequency and complexity of future military operations. The character of conflict, however, is also changing, so it's not just the environmental factors. Technology continues to be its central character. Now, there's a biorevolution happening. Spider genes can now be spliced into goat's milk. And that allows for spider silk spinning from goat's milk to create a biosteel that is 3.5 times the strength of mid-aramid fibres for armour. Nanotechnology, the production of C1 million Buckminster fullerene carbine, 100 times the strength and 1/6 the weight of steel. Low energy molecular petaflop computing. Now that's the computing power today. And when I came in, we were actually on a typewriter, and now it's in this sort of realm. And there's micro-powdered aluminium vortex-fed combustor engines that burn seawater. Everything will be nanotagged, and that includes everything on the battlefield, including people. There is so much going on in terms of the technology front, and I've got to admit that I don't know what any of it means, but NASA scientists say that this here will be in commercial production by 2025 to 2035. Just imagine that. Now, the other thing about technology, it is never decisive on the battlefield. It never has been, really, because it just leads to a stalemate as people identify a way to overcome it, and it never will be in the future. The other interesting element about technology is that peer competitors in the past have been defined by megatonnage of industrial age steel and aluminium. The reality is today that the drastically reduced entry investment enabled by what we call war on the cheap, with commercial off-the-shelf technologies, ensure that almost any nation or any sizable organisation, it doesn't have to be a nation, can be a very worrisome peer. Hybrid warfare. You know, we in the West, we chase the elegant technological solution, but smart adversaries will present us with hybrid threats. Hybrid war defined by, and this is the definition, there's many definitions, but the one I like is by Frank Hoffman, a blend of lethality of state conflict combined with the fanatical and protracted fervour of irregular war. Sophisticated campaigns that combine low-level conventional and special operations, offensive cyber and space actions, and psychological operations that use social and traditional media to influence popular perception and international perception. The struggles move beyond the physical elements of conflict, in which the manipulation of media, the use of the internet, and the integration of information operations with strategic communications programs are as important weapon systems for any sort of success on the battlefield. Hoffman said in his book, Hybrid Warfare and Its Challenges, that Hezbollah in 2006 in the Lebanese war exemplifies the prototype of hybrid warfare and a hybrid force. It is a fight, in its fight against the IDF, Nasrullah's forces proved to be a highly disciplined and professionally trained and able to operate in distributed cells throughout all types of terrain. Hezbollah combined the perilous blend of the lethality of the state with the fanatical and protracted fervour of irregular warriors. They clearly demonstrated non-actors' ability to study and probe the weaknesses of the Western-style militaries and devise appropriate countermeasures. Hoffman concludes that this is not an anomaly, but a harbinger of future wars. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is no different than what happened in Afghanistan, than what's happening in any of the areas that ISIL currently occupy. The adversary will be very flexible, adaptable, and able to conduct diversified operations. Concurrent intercommunal violence, terrorism, insurgency, and pervasive criminality and social disorder will be the norm. And tactics, techniques, and technologies will converge as they rapidly seek advantage and influence, including in the economic, financial, legal, diplomatic, and information means. And the Ukraine is sort of illustrative of that, particularly from the state perspective, when you look at the way that Russia strategically integrated all these elements. Their approach combined the physical military forces with regular and irregular, as well as the physical military forces of both regular and irregular, with information operations, provocateurs, and economic measures and actions in cyberspace. They play in what's called the grey zone of war, but not war. And they play it exceptionally well, acting just below the threshold of Article 5 responses from NATO. Separatist or nationalist groups and religious radicals gain their strength from urbanised, deprived regions of the world. Within these areas, the disenfranchised and economically advantaged youth actively seeking change are being empowered by technological process and influential non-state leaders. And they are masters of the battle narrative. The future warfare, or the future battlefield, it'll be information-rich, absolutely. We're overwhelmed by it already, but it's going to be far more than what it was in the past. And it'll be lethal, beyond belief. And most importantly, it'll be contested in the human domain, and this is where the West and the Western armies actually fail. The physical, cultural, and social environment that, as it relates to the sphere of human activity that exists within the area of interest is known as the human domain, or the human dimension. There is a requirement to understand all of the security threats, the social demographic groups of local populations, host national security and government forces, friendly military forces and international NGOs and PVOs. I'm talking probably in riddles, PVOs being private voluntary organisations, external support networks, and most importantly, how each of these actually interrelate with each other, with the population, and with the threat. That altogether is pretty daunting, but as I said, these characteristics should not be unique to anyone. But what we have been able to do within the four nations that sort of work on the doctrinal elements of this is pull together a number of meta-trends. And the first element of those is that it's going to be crowded or congested. And it's going to have, this won't make much sense, but red, green, blue and white forces. In other words, the enemy, the friendly forces, the government forces and civilians. It's going to have, as I said, NGOs and PVOs, contractors, media and issue-motivated groups. And we'll all be drawn into the urban littoral where people live and where the politics and economic activity is concentrated. And we need to better understand the metabolism of this environment, the way that cities are actually designed and worked. From the space, down through cyberspace, through the superstructure and into the subterranean, and the adjoining air and maritime domains. And it'll be connected, locally, globally, socially, economically, facilitated by global telecom networks, enabling near and instantaneous communications. The cyber, electromagnetic and space domains will be the subject of continual competition, with land forces increasingly enabled or disabled by access to the digital networks. What we have to do is actually look at the way that cyberspace in particular and cyber warfare is actually developing. And if you want to talk to governments, the scariest thing that they have on their plates right now is cyber warfare. And not just from an economic, industrial espionage space, but the fact that you can, actually it was classic on the TV the other day, when WikiLeaks and Julian Assange leaked the fact that the United States and the UK were both tracking and taking the feeds from the UAVs of the IDF, wherever they flew. But you can now turn those IDFs, you can now turn those UAVs around and attack whoever it is that sent them in the first place. Stuxnet, which is a malware which was put into the Iranian nuclear program to bring that down for a short period. Dark energy, which went into Ukraine, or Dark Soul, which was sent in to bring down the South Korean banking system. The fact that I could now, if anybody's got a pacemaker here, put in a piece of malware to actually turn that off so you can actually target people in terms of this cyberspace front line that we're talking about. Populations also have constant access to near real-time information. Social media potentially allows any individual, friend or foe, to influence political outcomes, to transform perceptions of events and create positive or negative responses that may dramatically affect the use of military force. And I look at three examples that are again, self-evident. Julian Assange, the way that ISIL uses social media. If you want a lesson in how to use it and how to shape, influence people, that's one key place that you can actually look. Or the Arab Spring. It'll also be cluttered, and by clutter, the battlefield will be cluttered. That means that once we've got all this technology and everything else, we're not going to be able to use it because there's all this other clutter coming in terms of subterranean and the superstructure and the cities and everything else where we're going to be working. It'll be constrained, and this is a key element that every nation actually considers. Legal and societal norms will place continued and possibly increasing constraints on the conduct of operations. Battles and operations will be fought in the living room of every politician and every parent in the country. Any legal, moral or ethical constraints which uphold our legitimacy and the legality of our operations are unlikely to restrict the actions or be reciprocated by the adversary. But we'll also be fiscally constrained. with limited budgets and mainstream procurement processes that struggle to deliver in time to meet the adaptability of a more agile opponent who are satisfied with war on the cheap. That ever-evolving 80% commercial off-the-shelf solution. As I said, we strive for the elegant solution, and the adversary will do that war on the cheap. Now, $120,000, that's about what it costs for a Javelin missile, is what we use to kill a $5,000 technical. A cheap phone, a timer from an old washing machine, or a movement sensor from a garage door, properly assembled with homemade explosives, or an artillery shell that you can just about scavenge from any battlefield. Now, at a cost of about $50, will destroy a $3.5 million, $4 million light armoured vehicle. And we know this because this happened to us in Afghanistan. And the component's about $50, achievable anywhere. All of that convergence happens in the human domain, the urban littoral, where about 6.3 billion of the Earth's population will live. And it's a population that we need to influence. But as I said, none of that should be particularly new or enlightening because it is just the weather and there's not a lot that we can do to influence it. The question is, so what? And to my mind, the major challenge is how can an army raise, prepare and train its soldiers with the necessary multifaceted knowledge and experience to take on this extraordinary broad and diverse range of missions and roles necessary to succeed in future conflict. An environment that we know will be exceedingly complex, unpredictable and unstructured, where not one but many doctrines are in play, and generally they're in play simultaneously. And that challenge is magnified 10, 20, 30 times if you're trying to put together a United Nations forces that have a mix of first world and third world countries. We don't know what's down the street, let alone what's around the corner. We must have the agility and the alacrity of mind to be able to adapt to the character of conflict as it unfolds. There'll always be a need, as far as I can see, I don't think it's going to change, to close with and destroy the enemy. So the need for firepower and kinetic energy, that's a given. Now that hardcore killer. But that same soldier will also need to be able to work in the highly nuanced context of the human domain and to be fully integrated with the other elements of national power. She must be the rescue worker, the lifeguard, the community constable, the peacekeeper, the nation builder and the public affairs person, and be prepared to kill without compunction when it's needed. It's one person. We must develop and institutionalise a cultural understanding in our education and training and deployed structures in order to develop the necessary insight to permit that understanding. Our education and training needs need to extend, and believe me, they don't, but they need to extend to anthropology, sociology, economics, psychology, history, culture, languages, futures studies, geopolitics, law, strategic communications, but most of all, we must also be able to understand and have the expertise in the profession of arms and the projection of military force. So that doesn't change. And what are some of the other concepts? Intellectual curiosity. It's fundamental to any military leader. The idea of a quick study, of creativity and innovation, of psychological and physical resilience, of resourcefulness. Now, they're very easy terms to actually state, but when you actually think about how you train an army and those sorts of characters, it is very, very difficult. So tomorrow's soldier will need to be comfortable in uncertainty, think critically in complexity, and be able to adapt to continuous change as well as being resilient to austerity. Nations will require militaries that are scalable and tailorable to the mission at hand and equipped and trained to adapt to the ever-changing character of conflict. Hybrid warfare, the pursuit of the asymmetric advantage, is unfolding before our eyes in this region. Syria, the Sinai, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Jerusalem, Ukraine, Afghanistan. These are all windows on what the future battle space is going to look like. Technology will not provide the whole answer, and an over-reliance on technical solutions may undermine our key capability, the ability of our soldiers to learn, to adapt, and to deal with the challenges confronting them as they unfold. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you, General Gawn. I'm not sure that I'm particularly, I don't feel any better at the end of your talk or reassured. And anybody who has a pacemaker, that's another lesson. Please don't do anything to attract the attention of any military. Thank you very much for this very rich talk of yours. I just highlighted a few words which I thought were interesting. You used the word challenge, complexity, hybrid, cluttered, constrained, destroyed, nuance, but then also towards the end, intellectual curiosity, resilience, innovation, critical thinking, adaptation, and all this as part of this hybrid warfare where, I mean, you're suggesting, and maybe you're suggesting more that it's not just a question of, you know, what someone like myself would think about in terms of the drones and the future and of robots and machines and all of this stuff, but also that presumably people also need to adapt to this in the armies, in the militaries, and to make use of this. But it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more as well, I think, maybe with the Q&A about this relationship between these machines that you know, maybe I can't even imagine, and people that are supposed to be either following or controlling these kinds of machines, and where personal freedoms or personal not being monitored and followed, and the whole surveillance techniques and networks, how that figures into what you talked about, the constraints and questions of legitimacy. Because it seems to me, at least in certain ways, that the question of legitimacy has gone down in terms of certain militaries, maybe not New Zealand, but certain militaries, not particularly, you know, moving away from international legal standards in both humanitarian terms, in warfare, in the drone attacks, all this kind of stuff. It seems that it's moving away from legitimacy and accountability and towards something much darker with this surveillance, with abilities to go outside of democratic structures, if there ever was any, in the UN, etc., these kinds of things. So I'd personally be very curious to hear more about that, and then perhaps as well how that fits into this region. You mentioned Syria, you mentioned Lebanon 2006, and other places like this. I don't know if you want to say anything, and then we'll open it up.
I'll just start with, first of all, the technology question. Now, technology is a wonderful thing, but where we struggle with technology is the fact that the only purpose of it is to influence the human domain. In terms of where, now you can win a battle, you can win an air war, and you can bomb, you know, a country into the smithereens. But that's not going to win you the war. You actually still require boots on the ground and the human interaction between people in terms of gaining a lasting peace. And the challenge that we have, I think, in terms of technology, aside from the fact that it's getting just extraordinarily expensive, is that we don't actually take what it was initially designed for and then consider the impact that it has on those populations. You know, in terms of ISIL, very simply, I think that it could be cleaned up very easily in a ground war, but you haven't got rid of the idea of a caliphate. And how do you do that? And technology is not going to provide the solution. And it's that, as I say, that human interaction that's absolutely essential to understanding how this whole thing fits together. Now, drones are wonderful. You can have, you know, the cost of, it's interesting actually, the United States in 2012, last year for the first time in their history trained more pilots to operate drones than they did to operate manned aircraft. If that doesn't give you an indication of where the future's going, nothing does. Once they get sorted out how to actually manage and launch drones, fleets of drones, swarms of drones and manage the radar and everything else that's required to keep them separate so they fly like flocks of birds and so on, then we're going to be in all sorts of problems. And the reality is that you can buy about 2,000 drones that can carry warheads for the price of one jet fighter. They haven't got that sorted out in terms of how to launch them. And you can launch them. You know, I bought one the other day, just a little drone that flies around inside really well when it doesn't crash. $39. Now, $39. Only goes for about 5 minutes, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. But that technology side of it, and the challenge with an army isn't the fact that you give them this technology and you train them how to use it and they'll use it in the best manner possible. The reality is that the adversary will identify a way to counteract it. And the challenge is to adapt that technology that you give your army, to adapt that to the situation, the character as it unfolds. Now, in Afghanistan, we had a challenge, and it goes on in every army, and that is the challenge of the IEDs. When we first went across there in 2000, we were driving around on the back of unarmoured pickup trucks with our 50 cals. We're sort of like ISIL with our 50 cals mounted on the top. But as the threat changed, and as the threat changes, it just becomes an ever-ending battle to overcome our technological solution with a very easy way to overcome it. So you put this bubble over the top so that you can have an area which is absolutely impenetrable to cell phones. So all they do is they work out where this bubble is, and they bring the cell phone into a point here which is outside it, which arms the bomb from outside the bubble, and then it becomes either a victim-operated or a different sort of operation in terms of exploding it. And that's almost impossible. And it's even worse than that, because what we did was we built heavier vehicles, armoured-proof vehicles, which now weigh, our first vehicle, which was 17 tonne, ended up weighing about 23 tonne. And the problem with 23 tonnes was it was collapsing the roads and our vehicles were rolling into rivers and things like that. But worse than that is because your vehicles are so heavy, you can only go down one track, so they know exactly where you're going to go. And they'll always find a way to actually overcome everything. And all they'll do is they'll build a bigger bomb, and it costs nothing. The issue of legitimacy, I think, is another challenge altogether. And as I say, part of it is this ever-evolving challenge between the adversary versus I'll call him the good guy, versus the good guy. And politics is what it's about. But in the end, we're held accountable by our parents. We're held accountable by our politicians. And unlike any other war, a land conflict is fought every night on the television in front of the homes. So it does have a significant effect in terms of what you can and can't do, notwithstanding the tragedy that's unfolding in Syria, notwithstanding the abhorrence that we all had with Abu Ghraib and everything else. That those things are going to happen, not because we want them to happen, but because of the human dimension that goes with it. So I think the legitimacy side of it is getting more challenging, far more challenging than it was when I first started. I'll leave it there and just open up the floor if there are any questions.
Thank you. Maybe there's a microphone. Maybe you can introduce it. Yeah, Rami.
Thank you very much, General Gawn. Thank you, Karim, and all the people who organized this. What is the relevance of international humanitarian law to the conduct of warfare today?
It's fundamental. It's fundamental. Remember, I'm doing this from a New Zealand perspective, but I think also from a Western perspective. International humanitarian law, the law of war, the law of armed conflict, the Geneva Convention, that bounds everything that we do. The challenge is the fact that you've got a 17 or 18-year-old who's at the point of battle, who has to make a decision which may be in the split second of what's going on. So at the tactical level, it's very challenging to actually bring them up to a level of maturity, of wisdom and everything else and training for them to make the right decision. And that's why a lot of the West is sort of values-based in terms of that. And they're all taught, as I say, the law of armed conflict and everything else. Now, not every nation's like that. And in fact, it's a challenge in terms of bringing up the United Nations to a minimum level so that they do all understand those requirements. But it also doesn't stop the likes of states to have the sorts of tragedies that are unfolding across the border. And the challenge is, how does the world hold them to account? And I don't think that's an easy answer either, particularly if it's a battle for, a sort of an existential battle for survival. I don't know whether that answered your question, Rami.
On here.
Yeah.
Then we're going to go back. So.
I have a question regarding one of the comments you made in your very thick, dense speech about the inability to win the battle with arms alone. And I would like to turn that perspective around a little bit, in the sense that arms can be used and have been used not just for benevolent Western goals, as I think your perspective is kind of based on, but you can comment on that, but also for suppression of or at least putting down the laws on the rest of the world. In that perspective, in a world in which the rest of the world is maybe increasingly unwilling to have the West put down the laws on them, what is going to be the reaction of the West to that? And especially considering the stark imbalance in technological and military capabilities between the people in the third world, or whatever you would call it. And
so we can have a chance for different questions.
My last sentence. And the Western countries. So, is it not possible or likely that the West is going to have a very different kind of approach, which is rather than is going to obviate the people or the threats, the conceived threats, something that you might be seeing now in Syria, at least done by the Russians, for example?
Okay.
I mean, all I'll say is possibly. War is. I do agree with Clausewitz. War is politics by other means, and there's good politics, there's bad politics. I used to think that the United States in particular, and the rest of us in the West should be the conscience of the world. And everything else, but maybe I'm a bit wiser than that now, and that's not how politics works. And politics is, among other things, about power. It's about egos. It's about individuals as much as it is about countries and everything else. And things spiral out of control very, very quickly. And again, I look at some of the challenges that are occurring on the northern border of Syria, and literally in the past few days, and you can read all that in the newspaper. But it's about politics. It's about perceived security. It's about power. It's about a number of things. And I don't think the world will never be nirvana. It's never going to be a utopia where everybody's going to live in peace. Because the whole concept of perceived relative deprivation is very real. And, where you sit in that chair versus if you knew everything about your guy right beside you, there is a relative deprivation difference that at the level that countries are talking about, particularly when you talk about economic well-being and energy and everything else that's required, it's never going to be a simple, straightforward world. And all I will say is that I like to think that, and call me naive, I like to think that people do the things they do for the right reasons as they see them at the time. Now that is naive, but in terms of New Zealand becoming involved in Afghanistan, we felt that it was the right thing. Whether it was or not, and whether it actually made it worse, that's two different questions altogether. I don't know whether I answered your question.
We have a couple of questions that if you don't mind...
I'll make my answers a little bit shorter.
You don't mind just introducing yourselves quickly. We have, and then we have also Ahmad over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Fatih Hassam. I'm here with the AUB. Thank you very much for your presentation. And just a couple of very quick thoughts and questions. Yeah. One is in reference to what's behind all of it. I mean, the idea that... I would say, the one thing you didn't mention that maybe it's worth talking about a little bit is the question of money, the question of industry, the question of the amount of money that exchanges hands in the process of the arms trade, in the process of, you mentioned that it's costly to have all these armaments into development, but it's also a huge money-making machine. And it depends on conflict to continue. The Israeli arms industry, for example, advertises its technological innovations in weaponry as field tested, for example, as one example. So, I mean, if you could just say a few words about that and whether anything we do can really change that proclivity to keep that money rolling. And the other question I have is about early warning and whether you know of any successful examples of early warning systems or early warning processes. It's often a term bandied about in UN circles. You find it, in some UN resolutions, and you find it in debates and discussions. But when you mention data and an aggregation of data that can possibly point to, as you did, very, very eloquently, future wars, water wars, resource wars, and tensions of that sort, and population explosions, to kind of point the way to what the international community or a regional community or a national community can begin to do something to avert a slide into conflict.
Thank you for both of those. First, I agree entirely with your first comments. There's so many countries, Israel, France, the United States, without a doubt, that are based in part on the military-industrial complex. And I'm not sure that anything's going to change that. Because, as you say, power is power. Money and the economy is actually driven by it. In addition to that is the whole concept of a war economy. And all of those that actually gain from a war, and it doesn't matter where it is. And there's the gaining from the war in terms of being able to provide the logistics, to provide the humanitarian aid. These guys that provide humanitarian aid, believe me, they're making money in terms of driving those trucks and convoys and everything else. That's part of the war economy. In addition to that, just after the war, there's another economy in terms of rebuilding. Those are all very real, and I don't think that the cycle is ever going to change, particularly that military-industrial complex that you're talking about. On the other point, all I'll say is absolutely. Ban Ki-moon right now is, and I'll use a term that the United Nations is fond of, we are seized of the idea that we need to put more effort into the preventative side of conflict. In particular, and it's one of the themes that has been taken forward in the United Nations over the coming sort of 12 months, 24 months. It's more difficult than it appears because, no country wants to admit that it's failing until it's failed. And one of the challenges that as a soldier or as a commander or as a chief of army that we've always had, I sat on, and I'll just use a little example, I sat on the beach, not on the beach actually, I sat on a frigate, watching the conflict in the Solomon Islands unfold. And there's an opportunity, and those opportunities are so small that we had to actually stop it in its track. But you've got to have the political will to do so, and to galvanise sufficient political will to stop an international conflict is almost impossible, as we find, until such time it becomes, it's almost war fatigue as it is developing, or the humanitarian crisis becomes more than the world is prepared to bear. But that preventative side of things, in terms of trying to identify, the information, the data, the trends, the key performance indicators, the key indicators that actually suggest or portray the fact that this is going down the track of conflict, is very difficult. We know that Egypt is in a power of trouble, but what's the world doing about it? And some of these problems are of such magnitude and such complexity, where do you even start? Let alone the cost. The cost of humanitarian aid into Syria right now, that's being eroded, or UNRWA is being eroded by a refugee crisis in Europe. So I think that that's going to continue to challenge us in the coming years. I think forever, actually.
Suzanne?
Hi. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned economical and structural underdevelopment as a major reason for conflict in this region. You mentioned Egypt, Hezbollah, I guess, as an adversary was mentioned. I was wondering if you could, I thought maybe one major event you missed out in the Arab region that was really a major reason for insecurity, warfare, and violence, and and it coincides with the creation of UNTSO, really, is the creation of the State of Israel. And so I was thinking maybe you could elaborate a bit on your work and your mission and your perceived role that you UNTSO plays in Jerusalem.
Yeah, just very quickly. UNTSO is the oldest mission in the United Nations, 67 odd years, since 1949. We don't have a mandate in Jerusalem. We're based in Jerusalem, but our mandate is in relation to the relationships between Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon with respect of Israel. And it doesn't have an end state. It has a conditions-based state, which is based around a comprehensive peace, which includes the Palestinian situation in terms of the West Bank and so on. So it's very challenging. We have two mandates, or not two mandates, two elements, significant elements to the mandate. One is the provision of United Nations observers up on the occupied Golan, as well as on the Syrian side of the Golan, which is in abeyance at the moment while the war's on. And the other one is in the area of southern Lebanon. And that's pretty well continuous and is in support of both UNIFIL and UNDOF. The other element is in relation to ensuring that we have a regional, not ensuring, but we have a regional mandate that allows us to help coordinate some of the conversations and the connections between each of the countries. And as that part of the mandate is quite unique in terms of missions, and is, I think, the only observer mission that actually has a regional mandate like that. So there's sort of the political side as well as the military side.
Thank you. Could I find out how many people in that area still want to ask some questions? We can
take 2 or 3 at a time.
Yeah, at the top there near Nadim. Anybody there? Okay, Nadim, go ahead, and then we have a few questions. We'll bundle them together here.
Thank you for the most interesting talk. Just want to comment on something. You seem to have, or we seem to be oblivious of the reporting on war. All we've talked about is fine, I mean, technology, etc., but it's presented to us through somebody else's eyes. And what we see is major destruction that is resulting of this activity that is reported differently. For example, when Serbia was being bombed, it was for the good of humanity. It's to save Bosnia-Herzegovina, etc. Nobody asked the Serbs how they felt. When we were bombed here by Israel during the 2006 war, and the massive destruction that ensued, as well as in Gaza later, again, it was Israel trying to save itself from the attacks by others and using technology that was presented, etc. This presentation of massive destruction being minimized to suit somebody else's goals. In this frame, it's Israel and the West, whereas any representation of resistance, etc., is called terrorism. So, and then you mentioned this, the poor fighter or the low-tech fight against high-tech. This all together, when you build it, when you put it together when you look at it from all perspectives, needs to be addressed better, needs to be looked at better. Especially when we look at warfare, it's the failure of societies. It's politics by other means, right?
Yeah.
It's failure of societies, and it is the result of inequalities. Inequality in power, inequality in sharing resources, etc. So I would just, this is a comment maybe, and maybe you can find a question in it somewhere, but this is where I'd like to have a perspective from you.
I'll be very brief. Yes. Not quite as brief as that. The front line, in my view, isn't the kinetic front line any longer. That's where the fighting goes on. But warfare today, more than anything else, is about influencing the perception of people. And it doesn't matter whether that's international perception or the perception of those who are actually involved in the conflict region. I mean the civilian population as well as the fighters and everyone else. It's done through the media. The media is where the power is. It shapes everybody's perception. It's the one that actually wins, UNRWA, its donations, or UNHCR. And I don't know what the figures are, but not generally. Often figures of refugees are inflated. And if you tie that into I use the term the compelling narrative. If you can achieve that, then you can turn anybody's mind to anything. And that front line, more than anything else, and this is the challenge that we have with soldiers. We're talking 18, 19, up to 25-year-olds. They have to be savvy enough to actually manage the media. And the media is at the front line of the battle, right at the locus. And you can no longer have the time that you used to have to be able to shape media in the past, because it can be done on a cell phone. We use crowdsourcing to determine what's actually happening on the battlefield. So you put out your view or your picture of where the front line is, where it's happening and so on. You put it out on social media and you just wait for the comments to come back when they say, no, the fighting's not there, it's down the street on the corner of whatever. So you correct your map. Now that's the power of media today. I don't know what the answer is, but it is, it's the real front line in terms of the strategic game, the strategic communications side of things. But I agree entirely with what you're saying.
Let's take 2 questions here, and then we have a couple more questions there.
Thank you. You gave some advice for the new skill sets that the military would need. What advice do you have for politicians and their civil servants with regards to how the skills they need in order to decide how to resource and deploy the military?
When so many civilians are killed in conflict, say airstrikes hitting houses, hospitals, and schools, etc., is it sometimes intentional, or is it technology, bad technology, or is it bad use of technology?
Let me add to that. When the Israelis hit the UN people in the 2006 war and others.
I'll answer the second one. I mean, it's fairly easy. Sometimes it's deliberate, I suspect. I don't know. I don't know what's inside the minds of people, but it would not surprise me that at times it's deliberate. Often it is human error, literally. It's like a drone. If you coming in on a target and you've got your missile, you've launched your missile, you have right up to 2 seconds before to be able to call that missile off. But if you turn your head because somebody has distracted you, it's too late. And your cycle of observe, orientate, act, and decide, act, that's become really, really tight. And in addition to that, the fact that the adversary generally tries to get below the threshold of detection, they do hide beside and fire beside schools, from within hospitals and so on. I like to think that we try as hard as we possibly can to get the right information at the right time. But it's a bit like, I'm just trying to think of one that's going on at the moment. If you say that, if you're at a particular environment and you say your neighbour, you have a disagreement with him, and the environment's pretty tense, and so you tell the authorities that he's spying for the other side, and they'll pick him up. I only say that because I know that some weapon systems, particularly where there are UN bases and so on, or not UN bases, but where there are protected areas, you can program your weapon systems, like guns and things, so that they can't lay on them, to override them, whether that's a technological failure, whether it's deliberate. Actually, an example is, and you may have seen this in the papers, there's a lot of speculation about the mortars that landed in the markets in Zanitsa, as to whether that was actually, in actual fact, a deliberate ploy by the side that, by the Muslim side at the time, to actually target that, to create the sense of urgency that was required to galvanize the world against what was happening there. So I don't know whether there are any indications or whether there are any cases per se, but certainly, as I say, weapon systems can be deliberately laid off, so you can't lay on to a target, and it requires a manual override. I'm not saying deliberate by the authorities, but deliberate by somebody perhaps, but a manual override to be able to lay it on top. But I don't know of any examples. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. As was Dresden and Coventry and all sorts of places in the Second World War. And I don't think that humanity's shifted a hell of a lot since then. On the first one, in terms of resources in relation to the politicians, the key to me isn't technology. It's the top 6 inches of a soldier, and it doesn't matter what rank, what gender, what nationality, but the top 6 inches, to have that understanding of how warfare actually affects people, how it works from a professional sense. The politicians here in Lebanon, and here in Lebanon, they've got military experience, a lot of them. In New Zealand, it's quite unique. I think there's one, and he had about 2 years military experience, and we don't have compulsory military education or anything like that in New Zealand. And it is a real challenge to educate the new politicians that come in every time in terms of what and how the military fits into national power. Now, it's not just diplomacy, it's diplomacy, military, information, and the economic. That whole gambit. And it is really challenging. We don't teach it in history, we don't teach it in schools or anything else. But I like to think the sort of humanistic side of people actually comes to the fore, and that politicians, again, this is naivety coming through, politicians are doing it for the right reasons, but a lot do not have much experience these days. There's a new generation coming through, generations that have been involved in all of these peacekeeping operations throughout the world, but they're probably still about 10 to 15 years away from politics in the main, if they want to get involved in it, God forbid.
We have 2 or 3 questions here. Yeah. One, then one.
Thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. First, I'd like to say that Karim first said that it doesn't make him feel any better when you're finished. I'd like to oppose this by saying that actually what you said makes me feel much better. If we view the modern format of war, the hybrid, as the poor countries or the poor people's answer to the hyper-technological warfare, and to tie it with what you said about you can win the battle, but you cannot have sustainable peace or continuous peace. Can we deduct from this that poorer countries or even non-state actors or organizations have managed to find a way of neutralizing to a certain extent, or more forcing the hand of the superior military force on the battlefield? My second question is, you put a lot of emphasis on drones, and I am confident that you are aware about the recent human factor of drone operators in the US. There's now a special psychological report about the effect of drone operating on these pilots. There's a high level of high percentage of suicide, of depression, the work conditions, containers in the deserts, and such things. And there's a serious issue there. And you also put a lot of importance on the human domain. I'd like, the second question is, I'd like your view on how do we reconcile the hyper-technological aspect of war. And you also talked about the kinetic front line. It's changing. It could be in the sky. It could be in the desert of New Mexico, the front line now. How do we reconcile the hyper-technological with the direct, like people die in wars, and being that far removed from the battlefield apparently does not remove the effects on the human factor. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Jihad Touma, professor of physics. I must say that as a member of a community which is embedded and networked to a large subsection of the population which is mounting resistance to the kind of project that you describe, project of warfare at a very large scale, I felt somewhat aggressed by your discourse. Now, to be fair, you were right in stating your position as that of the Westerner speaking to us. But I found it difficult to go past the we's in your discourse. You had multiple we's. You spoke as a we. I was confused. Are you a New Zealander? Are you a warring New Zealander? Are you a colonizing New Zealander? Are you a New Zealander who is part of a UN mission? I was very confused by the multiple we's and the slippages that you went through. When you were in Afghanistan, what were you doing? Who were you? So I'm curious about the you in all the we's. Okay, I'm curious in your personal story as a New Zealander in the middle of the Pacific, who also oddly enough does not talk about the Pacific as the future theater of warfare as conceived by the Obama administration. So it was curious to note that in your talk, you didn't mention the Pacific as the future theater of large-scale warfare. I would like you to comment on that also. So, but in particular, I'm really curious about the you and all these we's.
One last question.
Hi, I'm here from Mahsan Fighters Institute. Just building on the question of drones, you were a supporter of drones, as you just mentioned. Don't you think that this just increases the socioeconomic and technological gaps of warfare, and it makes it easier? For example, you mentioned like it's way easier to fabricate a drone than to have boots on the ground. Doesn't it making it easier for the West just to get involved in more conflicts, decrease the humanistic aspect of war or aid in case of right to protect? And how to what extent will this technology make it easier for other countries to attack poorer countries, or this poor fighter that doesn't have the technology to counterattack?
I'll see if I can go through all those. Actually, I'll start at the start. What was the force in the hand part? I can't remember that. The issue around the human domain and the stress, not the human domain, the human part of, and I'll call it the targeting cycle, which is in relation to drones. And incidentally, I hope you don't get the feeling that all I was talking about was drones. They just happen to be flavour of the month at the moment. But drones, in terms of anybody who is involved in the targeting cycle, and it doesn't matter where they are, whether it's back in, I'll use the term Langley, or whether it's the front line in Afghanistan, but any one of those that are involved in that chain of events that ends up with somebody killing, it doesn't matter how it is, the reality is that there is a high chance that they will suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It is one of the killers of soldiers across the world. It doesn't affect any politicians, which is interesting. But that's a reality of it. And it doesn't matter whether it's somebody who's actually an intelligence cell who's actually identified the piece of information at the time, or whether it's a person who's on the little stick in terms of the drone, or whether it's the person on the ground who's actually confirming the information at the time. But PTSD is a real disease that affects anybody, and it's not just soldiers either, because it's all the victims of warfare as well, who go through it in far greater magnitudes, arguably, because they haven't had as much training. So yeah, it's real. It happens everywhere, and it's not going to change. And I think that's because, again, I like to think that the nature of being human is that we don't kill other humans. But in actual fact, the world is such that there are an awful lot of people who are doing that. I don't know whether that answers the question, but it's something that every country across the world is grappling with, this issue of PTSD, both from the victim as well as those who are the perpetrators. The we and the me and the we. When I talk about we and when I talk about the West and I was referring actually not necessarily to the West as in the white European, US, UK, European, New Zealand, Australia sort of paradigm, although that's what I have been trained in. The reality is that if you look at any military that's regular force military that is part of statecraft, they are pretty well all based on a Western model. A Western, and when I say a Western model, I say Western, a model that includes hierarchy, that includes structure, that includes uniform, that includes some form of discipline, fitness, all of those trappings that are part of it. So when I say we, I talk about we as in we, the chiefs of armies. I used to, when I was chief of army, I ran a conference in which 34 chiefs came from around the world, all over the Pacific. That's the we that I refer to. That's the we that looks at and shares doctrine. And it's Asian, it's European, it's South Pacific Island. So I'm talking about it in terms of the structure of a conventional army, irrespective of where it is. Syria. Here in terms of the LAF, it's a Western model in terms of the way it's structured and everything else. And you can go to anywhere in the world pretty well and find that there are brigades, that there are regiments, that they have indirect fire, they have ISR, they have intelligence cells and everything else. That is the we that I refer to in terms of the challenge that we have across any army anywhere in the world to actually take that soldier, whether he is Lebanese, whether he is Israeli, who's dealing with knives on the checkpoints, whether it is somebody who is an American who's come out of the Midwest, or some Kiwi from way down south who probably has no real reason to be anywhere except down south. They all come from the same school essentially, because that's the model that we who wear this uniform actually use. The challenge with that we is that we are challenged by an irregular adversary who fights, almost existentially for what he believes in. Now, ISIL, that idea of ISIL, and they're fighting for a belief that, I can't comprehend. But that's quite a different beast in terms of what we've been taught and how we have been trained to fight. And the fighting in terms of historically of that we is conventional force against conventional force, generally in an interstate conflict. That's not what today is about, and it certainly isn't what tomorrow is about. So that's the we. In terms of me personally, New Zealand was in Afghanistan, absolutely. We had a provincial reconstruction team, as well as some special forces that were responsible for the security of Kabul, a provincial reconstruction team that was way up high in the mountains in Bamiyan to rebuild that province. We lost 10 in Bamiyan alone, and that was through this IED battle within a constraint, and again, this comes back to this constrained environment that we work within from a legal sense, from a social structure and everything else. We weren't taking the fight to the Taliban. When we got hit, we had to be able to operate. We had to be able to react, what we called appropriately. But there was no hunting. We were the hunted because we were trying to rebuild Bamiyan. So that's part of the we. I was involved in East Timor. I was involved in Bosnia as part of the United Nations during the war. I hope that sort of clears up a little bit of that. In terms of the Pacific Theatre, I tried to regionalise it just to make it a bit more interesting. My whole focus for 35 years has been on the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia. And our big elephant in the room is how to accommodate the peaceful rise of China. And this is changing, world politics, particularly in our region. And that's, it's another whole lesson, and we haven't got time for that. But it is truly challenging, and it's a different challenge to land conflict, because a lot of that has been fought on the right of freedom of the seas through the 7 mile, not the 7 mile mark, but through the South China Seas, and how that is actually being managed. They are becoming a responsible international citizen. And New Zealand has had a lot of interaction with them from the very start. In fact, New Zealand used to be the place they'd first come to for their first trips out of China, both politicians and military, because we were safe, we were inconsequential on the world stage, and we were seen as sort of a neutral place to get a feel for what the West was about. What was the other one? I've written down here technologies. What was that about?
Me.
Oh, sorry.
He's the guy who holds the mic.
It's about the economic aspect of more technology, making it easier for Western countries or countries to get involved in conflict. It takes them less time, less money, less effort. So doesn't this just make wars easy for anyone, except for those people that you mentioned, the poor fighter that doesn't have the technology or cannot go and intervene in another country?
Yes, but it cuts both ways. Yes, but it goes both ways. So, for Al Qaeda to bring down Twin Towers, that was an education program in terms of you already had your fighter in terms of those that were prepared to go out and die for that cause. But actual fact, the investment was actually in the pilot training within the United States, and a long time to build that up. It's very simple, I think, in both ways. To manufacture sarin gas, to manufacture chlorine, ISIL can now, according to some sites that you read, can now manufacture, not just capture, but manufacture chlorine gas. It's not expensive. You may remember the the time of all of the concerns around anthrax in the United States. You know, it brought their postal system to a close. That costs nothing. You know, there's so many things. Homemade explosives. Anybody here can manufacture that. Anybody can manufacture a bomb. And it's far easier to hide than it is within, you know, sort of a conventional sort of military apparatus. But you are right. You know, the United States, China, Russia, any of the big nations, probably India, can reach out and pretty well touch anyone that they want to. The key is to ensure that we bring them into the international community so that they are responsible citizens, whatever that means. And it ain't, as I say, it's not easy. It's not even easy understanding it. And as I say, coming here, after all my focus being on the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia, to try and unpick, I won't even say understand, but try to unpick just some of the basic elements of what's going on in this region, you know, it's fraught. Particularly after only 6 months. We even come here and sit beside in front of an audience that is all over it. Any other questions?
Maybe just 2 more 30-second questions, and then we'll wrap up completely. Okay.
Hello, my name is Omar Dewichi. I'm professor of anthropology and public health at AUB. So I want to challenge 3 assumptions that you had in this talk. The first one is that there is a changing nature of conflict in the region. Second one is that the Middle East is a laboratory of war. And I will get to the third one, but the question is, what kind of military history are we? What kind of military history we're talking about? Because for me, what goes on right now from the 1990s until the present day, the role of Western military powers in the region looks more like colonial wars of the 19th century. The way Britain was bombing tribal tribes in the south and north of Iraq, or the way France dealt with Algeria. There is a lot of echoes, similarities in how populations were dealt with, how their bodies became the target of urban warfare and all of that stuff. So for me, what is really new about these kind of Western interventions in the region, while they could be really easily linked back to the past? So that's one. Secondly, the idea that it's a laboratory, but who owns this laboratory? Who's really experimenting here? I come from Iraq, a country that's been under war for decades. And in the 1990s, we've been experimented on with so many kinds of technologies. Depleted uranium, recently in Fallujah, also white phosphorus, sanctions that killed hundreds of thousands of people and children. So I'm still worried that the nature of war hasn't really changed that much, but it's still more of the old thing, that the main goal and reason of war is to out-injure the enemy. For me, our bodies here are the ones that are taking these kind of, all these experimental weaponry, experimental forms of warfare. We're paying, and we're fighting back also through our bodies, through our kind of depleted biological capacity to explode or to die or to, and I'm talking here, you know, the same kind of poetics of war that you are using when talking about war as if it's something a little bit more fantastic and sanitized. It is not, because from where we stand, still we're facing this kind of war through our kind of bodies. And this is what really matters, through the infrastructures that we used to have and being bombed every day. And in a place like Iraq, right now, the drones are, yes, they're maybe killing ISIS, but you know, at the end of the day, the Iraqis are left with nothing, with no infrastructure. And at the end of the third assumption that I want to kind of address is you're saying it's all the power of persuasion, as almost if it's an ideological fight. If I can convince my enemy that they're fighting, I don't believe that. Because at the end of the day, that ISIS guy who is maybe turned to get some money and fight, I have to deal with him at the end of the day because he's my neighbor. You're going to go away and your persuasive kind of cultural discourse will not really matter to me that much. At the end of the day, I have to deal with that person next to me. I don't need necessarily a kind of a cultural narrative to tell me that I'm connected more, even though with someone I differ with ideologically and I fear from. But at the end of the day, I have to deal with that person. So these are the three assumptions that I felt problematic, at least from our perspective. So much war, and understand war through our bodies rather than through certain kind of discourses.
Final question.
Final question? Oh.
Hi, my name is Cynthia El-Mortada. I'm a student at the PPIA program. Actually, we're now trying to open up the UN and study it up close and personal. I have a comment, as you've mentioned before, that if we want to hold someone responsible for the mistakes and the failures that the UN have done previously, we can simply say that it's a human actor, a human error, or a non-human actor, a technological default, and that's it, ignoring all the influence and effect of major states on the UN actions. This is a comment. Do you think that's it? We can simply say this. And I have a question regarding the foreign policies of the UN. To what extent do you think the financial independency of the UN on certain states plays a role in its policy, in its foreign policy? That's it.
He said he promised a literally 10-second intervention.
My question is, technology becomes obsolete very fast. Other than the Arab demographics, what is the main fears and concern for the futures of the Israelis, in your sense?
I'll start with the last question, perhaps. You know, I think that there is still a deep-seated existential fear. You know, they still see Iran as one of the strategic enemies that they have, and the I guess not the influence, but certainly the relationship with Lebanon is still not where it needs to be. They both see each other as enemies, and that's challenging to the IDF. I think they have concerns. You know, I think. I shouldn't say I think, because I don't know what Israel thinks. But there are concerns around, you know, how the Syrian conflict will evolve, and who will be the key influences within that region. And of course internally, and you know, we read about that in the papers every day, and the UN through, you know, the special representative Mladenov is trying to resolve some of the issues through the United Nations and bring the parties to some sort of agreement around the occupied West Bank. And you know, it seems intractable to me right now in terms of some of the rhetoric on both sides and the challenges that go back so far in history. And I don't pretend to understand that history in sufficient depth to you know, sort of comment in any real meaningful way. But I live through it every day in Jerusalem. And it is, you know, it's one of the saddest things from where I was only 6 months ago in Jerusalem to where it is today. And the idea of, and the concept of trust within that city, let alone Bethlehem or Hebron or anywhere else, you know, it's not there to the level that you'd expect with a robust, vibrant city or civilization. So they've got some, you know, there's some real challenges in that space. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's challenging to say the least. In terms of your points, and couple of clarifications first. Now, my view is that I agree entirely. The nature of conflict has not changed. In fact, the nature of conflict I don't think will ever change. It is a contest of wills between people. But the character of conflict is changing. And you're absolutely right when you say you can take a model from previously, and you can actually go through and take periods across history and show that actually what's happening now, it has the same sort of characteristics as it did in the Philippines War in 1840. And, you know, one of the best books in terms of how to fight a counterinsurgency is Craig's Rifles and School Books. And that hasn't changed, you know, that whole counterinsurgency sort of construct and the environment that's within. But that was also about, in terms of how to win it, was about how to influence and change the views of a population. What has changed is the way that we conventional militaries actually train our people, and we've gone from a period of, you know, the Second World War, coming out of the Second World War in Vietnam into the airland battle that everyone went through, including the USSR and the Cold War and so on, where it was about maneuver spaces and the ability to be able to move around populations and avoid them and attack a similar sort of force. And yes, you had irregulars and the battle for the population, everything else going on at the same time. But as technology has improved, the detection threshold for an irregular or an army or a defence force of lesser capability has dropped. And to overcome that, they operate in mountainous terrain or restricted terrain, and more in the populations. And that is a change in terms of that. And the other element with it is information warfare, which, as I say, I think is the new battlefield, whether that's cyberspace or whether it's through social media and the media and everything else. And the time, just temporarily, that has constricted. So, you know, in Afghanistan and in Bamiyan, you know, I think we had an area almost the size of Israel, actually certainly about half the size of Israel, for one company, 100 people to manage that. Now, in the old days, 100 people would have managed an area of about 2K by 2K. So temporarily it's sort of expanded because of technology, but time-wise, in terms of your decision-making cycle, it's gone from, you know, from weeks or months through to something that's almost instantaneous. So I think that is the key change in terms of character. The nature, I agree entirely, has not changed at all. And that cycle, in terms of where we are, in fact, some writers are now saying that the next stage will be, we've gone from state war to intrastate war, and the view is that it will go back to state war in the future. And that'll be an interesting concept if it occurs. Culturally, I guess what I was trying to get at was, you know, your very comments in terms of culture and the fact that you have to live there and you have to live with your neighbour. You know, it reminds me very much, and this is exactly what happened in Bosnia, and the neighbours couldn't understand why they even fought with each other. When I talk about the need to understand culture and history and anthropology and sociology for a soldier, particularly of an expeditionary force, and all of these United Nations forces that come in to try and do good somewhere are expeditionary in that they're moving out of their country. What they don't have is the understanding that you have on the ground, but the interaction of that soldier in terms of doing the work that's expected of him is with you and your neighbour. So he's got to understand all of that, including, as you rightly point out, the culture of something like those who fight for ISIS. And for some of them, you know, it's, and again, I don't know, but I suspect it is to be able to put bread on the table every day and have a life and be able to educate your kids and so on. But that cultural understanding within, and I would argue, all armies, when they go to another country that they don't understand, is not something that we are teaching them, not even the concepts. And that's where, we need to be able to step up and do so better, so we can understand the things that you're talking about. There's a third one. Oh, and in terms of the laboratory, bad terminology. By laboratory, I don't mean experimentation. We have we have and you're right, I guess that is the right one. We have a term in our New Zealand Army which we call battle labs. And a battle lab, a battle laboratory, is something that provides a window on something that we're trying to understand. So it's sort of like a visitor coming in and having a look at it, as opposed to experimentation. And I applaud the resilience of any population that has to live through a war. As I say, having been through Bosnia and East Timor. East Timor had 80% of its population were killed. At the highest of any conflict, a small population, but 80% were killed over the 20 years. I applaud the resilience of people to actually be able to work through that and come through the other end. But, the reality, not the reality, and not but. We're all here to, in part, I think, to make a better world for our kids. And that's something that I think we lose sight of, particularly in areas of conflict. It was one of the lines of operation that we did, and we were able to bring both sides together, because it's not about this adult versus this adult. It's actually about the future of those kids that those adults on either side actually have. So I didn't mean it in that term, really, that it is a window in relation to the character that everyone is writing about in terms of conflict, and parts of it can be found actually in any battle space anywhere in the world. But a lot of the conflict in the world right now is happening in Africa and the Middle East, particularly in terms of UN engagement. Financial independence, actually Judy's probably the better person to answer that. That one. What was the question on financial? That was your one.
Other states. How does it play a role in its foreign policy?
I think the UN, again, I've only been in the UN as an employee of the UN for 6 months, so I'm on fairly shaky ground. But I think they try to do the best with what they've got. They certainly, and the intent is to be independent. But that independence is in relation to the decisions that are made by the General Assembly, or if it's peacekeeping, the Security Council, and the backdoor conversations in terms of who influences who, in terms of, why didn't we go into Rwanda when it first blew up? Why didn't we go into, I hate to say it, it's politics. And politics is as rife in the area of troop contributing nations or the General Assembly as it is anywhere else. It's just a smaller stage. Peter, I don't know whether you want any...
Perhaps influences that are seen as biased or not impartial. And I would agree. I think it's much less about money, and because everyone contributes something, both to the regular budget and the peacekeeping, but I think it's the members of the Security Council and the more powerful members among those who probably introduce the kind of influence that you're speaking about.
Before we close, just to thank everybody at IFI, Samar Ghanem and Michael and Amir and everybody who put this logistically together. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you very much to General Gawn for this nearly 2 hours. You've earned your dinner, and we very much appreciate and hope you'll come back and talk to us about the future warfare as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.